Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm so thrilled to be joined by the wonderful Bowen Yang to talk all about Saturday Night Live. And in your trajectory in joining the show, you obviously came on board first as a writer before coming in front of the camera as a cast member. And because there's so many aspects with the way that SNL comes together that are so specifically unique to that show, even just in terms of the form of storytelling that you're doing and the fact that you're putting out this live show every week, you're working with cue cards, you're working very collaboratively if you've written a sketch with all of the other departments. I was really fascinated in when you first started writing on the show and first stepped in front of the camera, what were some of the unique skills that you found yourself having to uniquely learn or hone or evolve, and how did writing for a season first really help in terms of figuring that out by the time you stepped in front of the camera?
Well, that's a great question because I feel like you're already you implicitly are aware of the fact that you know, that the show works in a very specific way. And in terms of the writing, in terms of having that experience beforehand, I think it was just about self-producing, knowing how to self-produce by the time I did stuff on camera. But I mean, honestly, I think the thing that taught me the thing that it taught me the most was that it was just about reading what was on the cue cards. Because sometimes what someone like from like an improv background like me, let's say, would do is maybe ad lib off of the cue cards a little bit. And people do that, and people do it very successfully. But most of the time, as a cast member, it's your job to just deliver what someone has written, whether it's you or someone else. And each word in sequence has been painstakingly, selected and written, and it's been tested in so many different ways before it makes it to the final cue card, that you go, let me just read what's on the card and go from there. I mean, I know that sounds so trivial, but it's something that I learned about just the process, that the content dictates the form, which dictates the delivery or the performance, or just anything that fits into the container of that show. Because I mean, I think what's remarkable about the show now is that there is just a wonderful cross section of a lot of different kinds of comedy. And so the challenge in being a cast member and a writer is just to sort of deliver on all of those different flavors or something. That's a very long-winded answer, but yeah.
No, it's great, and I love what you're bringing up at the tail end of that answer there as well, about it is so many different types of comedy, and if you take you performing as the Titanic iceberg, you performing Fran Lebowitz, you doing Trend Forecasters, those are all stylistically very different performances, even though they're within the same format of the show in essence. And there's also that thing of like, how overt and how heightened is the comedy, how pulled back and grounded does it need to be? And so how do you kind of go into figuring out the finesse of performance wise, what style of comedy does this need to be, and how do you kind of make that adjustment on the night as well? Because you have to remember, sometimes you're doing these sketches just minutes apart from each other, but having to bring very different performances.
Yeah, and it's about like sort of synthesizing notes and bits of feedback or changes from like different people, and whether it's Lauren or the writers or other cast members. Yeah, I mean, the way that you sort of make sense of it all is to, I think, go in on Wednesday at the table read stage of things, at the read through stage, just having an intention behind a choice. I know that sounds redundant, but I feel like the thing that locks things in for me at least is something that has to do with just making a choice about what the tone is, how grounded it is. If it's a song, let's say, if you happen to be in a musical sketch of some kind, you sort of understand the style of that. I mean, it all sort of, I feel like the concentric circles of everything sort of kind of lock in once you decide relatively early on, let's say Wednesday or Thursday when you're rehearsing or blocking stuff, that you make a choice to meet the content where it is in the style. And if you make a choice that feels incongruous, then someone will let you know and be like, hey, maybe don't do that. So, it's, I mean, that's the beauty of the show is that it's incredibly collaborative in all these granular ways that feels, and where the granules are so different from each other. Yeah.
And with that idea of making choices as well and having to kind of figure that out, it's also that thing where it's sketch comedy, but you have to create characters which feel grounded and connected to the audience. So again, even if we look at the iceberg from Titanic, it's like everyone can understand, well, everybody just knows me for this one thing and blames me for this thing that I don't even think was my fault, and that's all anybody wants
Right.
to talk about. And I want people to see me in this way and see this thing that I'm really passionate about. And so is that kind of like finding the really grounded connective tissue of a character also something that at the table read on a Wednesday is kind of where you start to find that, or is there a different part of the process where it comes through?
Oh, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think that the first time we did the iceberg at the read through, I mean, there was I wasn't wearing the costume, and the way it was written was much less grounded. It was just kind of playing in the absurdity of it, and it didn't quite work the way it should have. I feel like by the time it made it to air, it all kind of sealed itself in a nice way, but it was very reiterative. It just we kept changing it. And I think the thing that sort of made it all make sense was that was this idea that like, oh, it's this thing that like happens in the media, but where someone, wants to sort of reclaim their narrative and something. But how do we make that? How do we like build on that? I mean, I think my big takeaway from this past season, something that Lauren kind of always says to all of us on the writing staff and the cast, is that you want to build the place you want to go to instead of just coming in at a 10 from the very beginning. And I think that's so invaluable. That's something that you kind of take for granted when you work in a sketch show. When you go, oh well, it's only 3 to 5 minutes anyway, so like let's just be as expedient as possible in our writing and in terms of what we want to communicate. But sometimes you might want to spend the first 30 seconds to a minute just like setting up some base reality, and then sort of slowly, gradually feeding the audience what you want to serve at the table or something.
Yeah.
I'm mixing so many different analogies, but yeah.
That's such an interesting point. And I also want to talk a little bit about impersonations, which is such an inherent part of being a cast member on the show. And, in particular, when you first came on and we're doing impersonations like Andrew Yang, I know Chloe Feynman was a really great resource, and the two of you kind of sat together and you got to really kind of see her process of how she would kind of break down and find the characteristics. And when you're now doing impersonations, say you're playing someone like Fran Lebowitz, you're not doing a literal dramatic impersonation of her, but it's right. What's the essence, what are the nuances which are important for the audience to feel that this is that character, and then what's the version of that fits into the comedy aspect and the sketch comedy aspect of that. And so for you at this point, how do you kind of, harkening back to when you first started doing it on the show, kind of carry through elements of that to figure out what are the things that are really important that the audience needs for that familiarity, and where can I kind of give myself a little bit of looseness for what the sketch needs?
I mean, I should say that I don't identify as someone who is good at impressions. It is this perennial thing about the show. It's always nice when someone has that skill. I am someone who doesn't and has to sort of find little hacks and cheats and stuff in order to like get where I want to go. I mean, when I started out, that Andrew Yang thing was, I mean, to be honest, I look back at that and go, ooh, what was I doing? It's my first show, and then I did him, I think, one more time after that. And then 2 seasons ago, or at the end of season 46, I tried a new version of Andrew Yang at the table for update. And it really worked, and it really played. It just didn't go to the show because it was just it was the finale of 46 and there was just a lot going on. But it played well, and there wasn't really a great time to bring him back this past year because he wasn't as in the news quite as much. But anyway, this is just to illustrate this point that I think it took me time to figure out what was the perception around Andrew Yang on a more like scaled level. Like, it seemed that more people knew him and more people had this shared opinion about him, which was that he's you know, he's just this like dorky guy in a way. And so how do you play up that comedic trope into an impression? I feel like that was the thing that I didn't quite marry in the beginning, is getting the sort of technical aspects of the impression down in terms of the timbre of the voice and mannerisms and all that stuff that Chloe is just such a is so virtuosic about. But it was about mirroring that with some comedic take. And I think in the beginning it was a little difficult because I think we were just getting to know him. The public was just getting to know him in the 2020 primary and the election. So I think now that time has passed, now that we know what he as a character is like in the real world, I think that's the thing that sort of helps it ferment. And so for me, it just takes a lot of time, I guess. And so it's a journey. But with Fran, it was just, I mean, Fran, like there was some sort of media persona around her that was just very easy to lock into. So yeah, it depends on the subject, I guess.
You know, and playing Fran was also, you know, a great example of the ferocity and the speed of the show and how quickly things can come together, because that was you sitting at home watching on a Tuesday and then Saturday you're playing her after the idea came to you.
Right.
And with that immediacy and with the fact that you get that incredibly quick feedback when you're going through a season, do you allow yourself, is it helpful to kind of engage and really look at what are people responding to, what are the ways that they're responding to it, why are they responding to this specifically in this way, to kind of make adjustments as you go through the season? Or do you, because of how fast everything's moving, is it just kind of, I just have to keep my head down and just kind of get through the next show and get through the next show?
I think it's the latter. I think it's just about making it through the season. It's hard to go in with a holistic plan before the season. And like, I think now we're talking in the summer before, like in like the month or so before we go back to the show. And this is like the time when everyone starts to, you know, vision board out their season. And I feel like that's a wonderful exercise. I feel like I didn't really do that this past season for 48. I feel like I kind of went in with an open mind, and I think it sort of worked out nicely for me. I feel like I kind of knew in the back of my mind, I was like, I'm probably not going to have another iceberg moment. That just feels like, and it feels like too lofty of a thing to try and duplicate. You know, I should not think in that way where I like call a target that's so arbitrary and sort of lightning in a bottle. Like it has that quality about it. And so I was like, let me just go into the season like trying to lean into some utility more, try to do things that I hadn't done yet on the show. I was eager to just straight man. I was eager to just be like the normal person in a sketch to call out the weird thing. And I kind of, those are the things that stand out to me this season, is I was like, oh gosh, like I really enjoyed those moments, because sometimes that person scores the most in a sketch. I think Mikey Day is a perfect example of that. Mikey Day is typically someone who writes these sketches with all these, you know, these absurd premises, but he always prefers to be the person to just call out how silly something is. And I just really, I really liked that. But in terms of picking up on what people are responding to, yeah, I mean, it is informative. It is definitely informative. I don't know that I've really usefully synthesized that information yet.
And because you're bringing up, obviously, you know, right now is the off season for you. I want to talk a little bit about your writing and kind of the relationship that you have with that outside of SNL, because in SNL, you're writing in such a specific way, and you're writing, you know, these very short bursts of characters telling a whole story in a few minutes. But obviously, you know, kind of like always with a mind to other things that you're looking at towards the future and other projects as a writer. That's kind of recalibrating the way that you work a lot outside of it. And is it something where in the off season you're kind of like able to focus on or kind of sit there with different forms of script writing, or, you know, by the time you get to the end of the season, is it just kind of, I just need to shut off a little bit now? Because I think it's so fascinating that calibration between two very different spaces in the way that you work.
Exactly. This is something that I'm, you know, working out in therapy even is that we're talking with my therapist about site specific writing. I think it's the latter that you mentioned, where on the off season I really just put up my walls as far as my writing process goes, because it's just so, you just have to really work yourself into this pretty extreme discipline with it when the season is on, and it's pretty taxing to just, I don't know, churn that out. I think for me at least, there's some people who, some cast members who are just so stellar at the writing aspect of it. Mikey, as I said, Heidi Gardner, Andrew Dismukes, people who just are who are very, very, very adept in that way. I feel like I've sort of I think I'm finally settling into like a nice comfort with my writing process. Even when I was starting out as a writer, I felt like there was this anxiety around trying to fit into a mold that SNL has already carved out in terms of, thinking, oh, I should write a game show sketch because that's been done before, or I should write a commercial parody because that seems reliable. But I think I've come around on this idea that like you can do that, but you can also do stuff that's just squarely in your sensibility and doesn't really have to like subscribe to like some templated thing, which is also, I mean, those things. That's just to say that those things are just as valid as are equally valid. And so, yeah, I just the short answer is like I haven't really done too much writing on the off season this year because I'm just like, let me decompress. Let me just focus on these other projects where I'm not being asked to do that.
And going back to some of the specific comedy elements of SNL as well, one of the things that's really unique is that ability to use the camera as an engagement with the audience in certain ways. So like Trend Forecasters, I think is such a great example of that, where it's okay, now the camera's coming in really close, we're breaking the fourth wall completely, and we're going right in on this connection with what we're shouting at the audience about communicating.
Yes.
And so when you're writing a sketch, you're figuring out your performance for a sketch. How do you think about those moments and the ways that you can really utilize the camera in a different way to connect with the audience?
Right. I mean, with Trend Forecasters, that was originally written as a sketch with the host, with Willem Dafoe, I believe, that week. But we were asked to adapt it, as it were, into a weekend update piece. And so surprisingly, it did not alter too much in that sort of translation, because we were like, okay, well, we can just cut to the close up anyway, because we had that in the original script. I mean, it's just something that it's just something that you write in as you give a piece texture, and you go, how do we make this interesting? Because I think the best kinds of writing, I think, that happen at SNL are the things where multiple people are writing one piece, and the main goal is just to make the person laugh in the room, is to make the other person laugh. And then, and you kind of think, well, if they're laughing, then someone else might too. And I feel like with the awareness of the camera, I think that's what makes Weekend Update my favorite place to perform on the show, because it is efficient, it's direct. You sort of just get to inhabit a character for 3 minutes to 4 minutes, and then you're out. And it's just as terrifying as it is exciting, because it's just you up there. And or if you're lucky enough, you have someone like Adie Bryant next to you. But when it's just you up there, it's pretty it's a pretty big statement for you to make, and that can go either way. But yeah, I feel like that's that awareness to that breaking the fourth wall is something that you can probably have the most fun with on Update. And so how do you sort of tweak it and to make it just a little bit more intriguing? And that's probably what went into Trend Forecasters.
Yeah, and one of the aspects performance-wise that I always just find so impressive in watching the show is that necessity of conviction for completely new concepts every single week. You know, it's not, you're not bringing back the same characters, you're not bringing back the same sketches every single week. You're having to go out there and do completely new material where you don't have kind of a footing to know how it's going to land and how it's going to connect with the audience. And so what have you found to be the way that you kind of navigate through that idea of, I'm going out here, you know, without as much of a safety net beneath me, but I have to sell this or nobody's going to connect to it and nobody's going to buy into it?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like this past season, it was a sketch that we did. It was a sketch that we did the third episode of the season where um I was dressed as a spider and I had like these like prosthetic legs, and that was all sort of in the performance of it. I just, in terms of like just in terms of setting it against the context of the sketch, the rest of the sketch, where it's, you know, just like a school assembly and it's kids being cute, dressing up as insects, and sort of like a classic normal not situation where it gets to me and then I, you know, do this like very basic amateur voguing. Um, but that was something where I thought, wow, it all depends on whether or not the audience is interested in this. And I remember doing it the read through and it going well. And I went, okay, well, that's sort of one little sort of patch of safety net that I think I can like work with. And then it was just building it out from there and just making sure the costume was just right. And the beats of the sketch were playing out in the right way. And then thankfully it did sort of, I think it did succeed on that level, but it was the thing where I was like, it's all on me. Like, even though I have, but it's all on me. And even though there are all of these things that are buttressing the production of this, like, how do I make sure that this does not fail in the cut where it's just in the single cut on me, where it's just me doing something and people at home this is all people at home are seeing, because people in the studio can see things that are off camera, but you got to sell it to the people watching, you know, on Hulu, on, you know, on YouTube the next day or something, you know. That's what's interesting.
I mean, with everything that you're saying there as well, I imagine that, you know, even if you'd been doing the show for 20, 30 years, that there's still always going to be certain nerves and certain adrenaline, because it's that new cycle every week, even though there's elements of familiarity at this point. And so do you feel like your relationship with what that feels like and what that looks like has kind of evolved and changed as the show goes on? And are there different versions of it even week to week at this point, depending on what you're going out there and what you're doing and what you're having to sell in a particular sketch?
Yeah, I mean, I do think especially even going into this season is my fourth season on the cast. I feel like there is this data set, I guess, for lack of a better word. I have like more data points in terms of the last 3 seasons of being on cast. But then I look at someone like Keenan, who's been on the show almost 20 years at this point, which is incredible. And I look at him and he's just as present, is just as engaged, is just as challenged by this idea that, you know, you kind of have to come up with something new, and that sensibilities change in comedy, that comedy is just a reflection of the culture a lot of the time. And so he's aware of that. He's very aware of how to have his skill set and his talents match up with something in the culture that he can sort of engage in comedically. And so I feel like right as I start to feel some comfort and familiarity is when I know to sort of agitate that a little bit and think, well, let's just rethink this, because I feel like there were some fun moments this season that I thought, wow, I hope that demonstrates something to myself about what I can do. I wasn't quite as concerned this season with what the audience thought. I was really, really, really attached to that notion my first 2 seasons on the cast, was really trying to play to answer your question from earlier, maybe, was really trying to respond in the moment to what the audience was liking from me. And it was nice. It was a good way to sort of secure some relationship to the audience. But as far as like my own gratifying way of being on the show, I feel like it's more about what I want to do. And I feel like there were some really nice moments of that this year.
Yeah, no, I think it was, you know, every season's always so great for different reasons. And you had so many great sketches and moments, and your performances were always so fantastic this season. So congratulations on everything with that and the current Emmy nomination. And thank you so much, Bowen.
Thanks, Mara. Thank you so much. This was lovely.